Hi everyone, my name is Karen Kirsten and it's so good to be with you today, and I'm going to share a story with you about my mother and some of the heroes who saved her during World War II. My mother, Yawasha, raised me Christian in Australia, as you can tell from my accent. She was a kind, optimistic, very outgoing person who had legions of friends. My father used to say when we were at a social event, she would go on her goodbye tour around the room where she would spend a lot of time talking to people as she was saying goodbye to them. And her goodbye tour would take longer than the entire social event itself. But growing up, I always sensed something was off. My mother and my grandparents seemed to be hiding a lot of secrets behind this wall of silence. I knew my mother and my grandparents, Alicja and Mietek, had been born in Poland, and I knew my grandparents were racially or ethnically Jewish, and they were atheist. They never talked about the war. When I was 5, I asked my grandmother about the blue-green numbers she had on her arm, and she didn't blink. She said, "Oh, that's my phone number. I had it tattooed there especially so I'd never forget it." My grandfather didn't have a tattoo because he wasn't imprisoned in Auschwitz, but he had other scars that I didn't know about as a child. He would swing from playing chasey and hide and seek with me to sometimes when I stayed over, he would sit in his blue velvet chair staring at a wall for days. And now, of course, I know that people who survive the extermination camps and those who go through war to this day often battle with PTSD and depression. My family were hiding a lot of secrets. When my mother was 32 years old, she received a letter from a stranger in Canada named Dick. And as she opened it, this leather pouch fell out. And she recognized the photo on the bottom of her as a child. She'd seen it on Alitzia's dresser. And the man who wrote the letter, Dick, said that he was my mother's biological father and that his wife, Irena, had been murdered during the Holocaust. And she was my mother's biological mother. And Irena was Alitzia's sister. So I know this is a little confusing. So here's a photo taken of Alicja and her family together in 1939 in Warsaw, Passover. It was the last photo they have of the family together alive. So here's the grandmother I grew up with, Alicja, the one with the tattoo, and her sister Irena and their parents. And so you can see it on a family tree. This is the photo on the cover of Irena's gift. It's Alicja with her sister Irena, who is my biological grandmother, and Alicja was married to Mietek and Irena to Dick and my mother Yawasha. Well, my mother kept that letter secret from me, and when I was a teenager, I discovered by accident that the grandparents I adored weren't actually mine. So during my gap year, I went to live with Dick in Canada for a while. And at night, he would drink a scotch or two, and he would tell me about his beloved Poland, how he was an engineer before the war, he'd served as a captain in the army, and then he would start telling me about what happened when the Nazis dropped bombs on his beloved Warsaw. And then he told me about Dachau and other camps. And I was 18, and as you can see, I really wasn't interested in those horrible stories. I didn't know what to do with them. And then when I was back in Australia, the movie Schindler's List was released, and my grandmother asked me to take her, not my mother or her son. And a week later, she asked me to take her out to dinner. And it was when we were eating, she told me for the first time about Dr. Mengele, who the Auschwitz prisoners called the Angel of Death, and how he would line her and the other women up for hours in the snow, and he would inspect them with his white gloves and whip and pull women out from the line next to her. You know, I didn't know back then that Genocide survivors sometimes tell their grandchildren what they're unable to tell their own children. And later I moved to Boston, and for the first time I was surrounded by lots of Jewish people, as opposed to the people I met in my grandparents' living room drinking coffee, who I thought of more as Hungarian or Polish. None of them went to a synagogue, and many of them were also atheist. And so in Boston, my neighbors and people I worked with invited me to celebrate holidays I'd never heard of, like Rosh Hashanah and Hanukkah. And the itch to find out what happened to my family became a fixation. So I phoned my grandmother and asked her if I could interview her. And I flew home to Australia on vacation and recorded her over a week. And on the last day, she said to me, "I worried what happened to me will happen again. Do you think someone will want to know all of this?" And that is when I promised her I would tell her story. But my career in the US took off and Alicia passed away. And one night after work, I must have been thinking about her, and I was Googling my grandparents' name. And I stumbled upon a film clip that was taken by Hollywood filmmakers days after the US Army liberated Dachau concentration camp. And I found myself staring at my grandfather Mietek, the same grandfather who had carried me on his shoulders and played hide and seek with me.
Now, though, that is view of Dachau.
Roll number 4, SPX Germany, Dachau concentration camp, Mr. Dortheimer.
Rolling. Thank you. Mr. Dortheimer, how long have you been held as a prisoner?
I've been held as a prisoner for 3 years.
3 years.
3 years.
Why are you held as a prisoner?
Because I'm a Jew. That was a matter that I was taken in prison. They treated us as worse than the worst beast. Every night, every day, he was afraid not to be taken to the crematory, not to be killed by gun, or everything you could be abused to death.
Have you had many friends that have gone to the crematory?
No one of my friends left. All are in the crematorium or in the crematorium. That was the best way.
Many of your friends have gone to the crematorium.
Oh, yes. All.
Oh, no.
All have come. That's a question, but what we have not in picture now. We are more than sure that nobody lives from our families. Only this small, few men which are here. So we are now without homes. Our homes we are spread out from our homes in Poland as the ghettos have been made, and then we have been put out from the ghettos and taken to the concentration camps. Now the problem, every other nations can go home. So know the addresses, we know that there is somebody waiting from there, the family, the wife, the father, the children, and we don't know what will be now with us. We have no place to go back. We are as beggars without home, without anything.
He was 34 years old and he weighed 85 pounds. When I found this video, I quit my job and I went to Poland to find out who Alicia and Mietek were before the war and how they survived. But I also wanted to find out why Alicia seemed to dislike my mother so much. She adored me. We would go to the ballet together and to concerts, but she would always be snapping at my mother. My mother told me that growing up after the war, Alicia and Mietek beat her. And so that's what I focus on in Irena's gift, and I won't cover it today. Why did my grandmother Alicia risk her life during the war over and over to save my mother and then treat her so poorly? What I really wanted to find out in Poland was I wanted to locate the people who had saved my mother during the war. So let's go back and I'll tell you about a few of those people. After my grandparents married in Warsaw, my grandmother Licia moved to Mietek's hometown of Krakow. My grandfather had studied law there, but after Hitler's rise to power in Poland in the 1930s, Jews were banned from practicing professions like law and medicine. So Mietek went to work in his father's printing supply business. And then in 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, my grandparents fled Krakow and they jumped into their car. But on the outskirts of the city, Polish officers who were possibly also fleeing, they took their car away, telling them that Jews aren't allowed to own cars. So my grandparents walked more than 200 miles to the city of Lvov, which was in the Russian zone. Today, that's Lviv in the Ukraine. And along the way, German planes were shooting at them. Ironically, this is the same road that Ukrainians fled to Poland after the Russians invaded. Meanwhile, Dick and his new wife, Irena, escaped to another city in the Russian zone. So Irena was my grandmother Alicia's sister. And then 1.5 years later, Dick and Irena went to Lvov to visit Alicia and Mietek. And one morning, Dick was walking down this main boulevard that was teeming with refugees. Sadly, today, there are many refugees in this area. And Dick noticed in a shop window a display of writing materials. There was a fountain pen and some black ink and some writing paper. And before the war, he loved to draw. So he bought the ink and the materials and took it back to my grandparents' apartment. But that night, he couldn't sleep. He heard artillery booming in the distance. The Germans were advancing on Lvov. So he woke Irena and Alicia and Mietek and told them to fetch their ID papers that were written in the exact same color ink that he had just purchased. So with his fingernail and thumbnail, he scratched out the word Jew, and with this black ink, he wrote Polish. Well, the next day, Germans and Ukrainians knocked on people's doors and asked to see papers. And if they were Jewish, they hauled them out into the streets and beat them. They killed over 6,000 people. When the Ukrainian militia knocked on Alicia and Mietek's door, they looked at my grandparents' papers and left them alone. Meanwhile, Alicia and Irena's parents' home in Warsaw had been walled off by the Nazis into what later became known as the Warsaw Ghetto. It was surrounded by a wall more than 10 feet high, and the Nazis crammed over 450,000 Jews, that was over 30% of Warsaw's population, into an area of 1.3 square miles. That's 11 times the density of New York City. My grandmother Alicia was desperate to see her parents, so she paid a smuggler to take her 250 miles to Warsaw. My grandmother was always scared of heights, and I learned why, because her smuggler made her crawl over steep roofs like this, and he would knock on a roof tile and someone would lift it up and they would crawl down into an attic and through a false wall into the next apartment and then up onto the roof and across the tiles and so on. And down below, Nazis were patrolling the streets. Well, the next morning when my grandmother was at Orla Street, where her parents' home was, she was horrified. There, in the streets, there were people starving to death, hundreds of people lying dead. Around 80,000 people were died of starvation and disease in the Warsaw Ghetto. And that was the last time that she saw her parents. Her smuggler came to take her back to Lvov, where Dick and Irena were still there because it was too risky for them to cross into the Russian zone. So they hid in Alicia and Mietek's apartment behind a cupboard. They had cut a hole in the wall and pushed a cupboard up against that. But then they found out Irena was pregnant. And at that time, the Nazis banned Jewish women from having babies. And Irena told Dick that she wanted to have her baby in Warsaw with her mother and begged Dick to try and smuggle her into the Warsaw Ghetto. So the first hero I want to tell you about is a man named Roman Talakovsky. And he was a customer of Alicja and Mietek's father, who owned a successful leather wholesaling business in Warsaw. And Roman owned and operated a small glove shop on a main street in Warsaw. And after the Germans banned bank accounts for Jews, Alicja and Irena's father gave nearly all of his money and leather hides to his wealthy non-Jewish friends or business customers, and to Roman he gave a really small amount. And even though the telephones were working in the ghetto and you could send mail, he never heard from his wealthier friends again. But Roman found a way from time to time to smuggle a small amount of money and food into the ghetto, and he kept my family alive. So with Roman's help, Dick was able to smuggle Irena into the ghetto through a hole in the wall. And Roman also got Dick false papers through the underground and found him an engineering job in a city 200 miles away from Warsaw. And from time to time, Dick would march into the ghetto in a column of labourers to see his wife, Irena, and he would pass bribes to guards on the gate. In July 1942, Irena gave birth to my mother on the kitchen table at her parents' home, and Dick was there. But a few weeks after my mother was born, posters went up decreeing that all the Jews would be resettled somewhere else. And then from July 22nd, they started rounding up people and herding them onto trains for the Treblinka death camp. Around 300,000 people were sent there. Mietek's father got caught up somehow. All of my grandmother's aunts and her uncles and her cousins and nearly all of her friends. Well, Dick knew he had to get his wife and my mother out of the ghetto. And so he gave my mother 2 sleeping pills. The doctor who had given him the pills said that 2 pills might kill her, but he couldn't risk her making a sound. So when she was asleep, he tucked her into a backpack and he pushed Irena out through a hole in the wall, and he walked out through the main gate with my mother on his back. Well, Roman Talakovsky found Dick a job in Warsaw, and he found his family a place to hide in a tiny room in a large house. That room was in the attic, and this house was on the outskirts of Warsaw, about an hour by train. And Dick and Irena hid in this house until my mother was 11 months old, until the day Dick came home on the train after work, and neighbours on the platform told him that the Gestapo had shot and killed Irena. So Dick ran down the street and up the long driveway to the house, and he could hear my mother wailing. And he found her crawling on the floor, dragging Irena's bra behind her. Irena must have removed it before the Gestapo killed her. And sewn into the seams of the bra were her mother's jewels. Her mother had given them to her before she was smuggled out of the ghetto. Well, at this point, Dick knew the Gestapo could return at any moment, so he grabbed my mother and the bra and ran from the house. He had lost his wife, and so he decided to join the underground to avenge her death and to fight for Poland. But no one wanted to take care of my mother. She was a very dangerous Jewish-looking child, like me. She had jet black hair and chocolate eyes. So Alicja, the woman I knew as my grandmother, Irena's sister, offered to take my mother. She was living on false papers, and she had auburn hair and looked less Jewish, and she was living 200 miles away with her husband Mietek in a city called Tarnów. While Dick was working for the underground, he secured a job in a factory in Radom in central Poland. And this factory made insulating panels that contained wood shavings that were made in a sawmill 15 miles away from the factory. And at night time, Dick and other members of the underground would hide escaped prisoners of war and Jews under floorboards in a warehouse. And when the Nazis began rounding up and massacring Jews here in Tarnów, Dick managed to get the man I knew as my grandfather, Mietek, a job at the sawmill connected to his factory. And my grandparents went there and left my mother here in Tarnów with a nurse friend who worked at the Catholic hospital that was situated inside the ghetto near this town square of Tarnów. And while they're away, the SS Untersturmführer in charge of Tarnów, Armin Goeth, who is the commandant portrayed in Schindler's List, he ordered all Jews to be rounded up for trains to the camps. And when Dick got word of this, he drove there, and his driver managed to get him through 3 SS checkpoints as they made their way through screaming crowds to the hospital to try and find my mother. And again, she escaped death. For a few months, as you can see from this photo, my mother actually had it pretty good because my grandmother was made the cook at the sawmill, and so they had enough to eat. Until the day in January 1944 when the Polish police knocked on their door to arrest them. My grandmother tucked a white teddy bear into my mother's arms and left her wailing in her cot. And they were taken to this prison in Radom and chained to this pipe in a tiny cell underneath the ground in a basement. It was dark and the air was thick with the smell of sweat and urine. They didn't know that Dick had been arrested a few days earlier with other members of the underground. He was beaten and interrogated daily at Gestapo headquarters a mile away from the prison. There were 500 members of the Polish underground who were tortured here, and Dick was the only Jewish member of the underground of 10 people to survive. But my grandmother didn't know about Dick's work in connection with the underground because underground members took an oath that they would never talk about their work, even until death. My grandparents were interrogated here at Gestapo headquarters too. My grandmother told me that the SS man who interrogated them never sent women back to her cell alive unless they were beaten terribly. But she claimed that he never touched her. Eventually, Alicia, Mietek and Dick were able to write messages to each other on tiny little pieces of paper that they rolled up and stashed in little cubes of bread that sympathetic Polish guards would smuggle between the cells. And this enabled them to get their stories, keep their stories consistent. Well, more than a month after their arrests, my grandmother Alicia got word to her SS officer who was interrogating her that she had some secret information and that she needed to see him with my grandfather. So they sat in an interrogation room at Gestapo headquarters and he asked them about their information. Well, my grandmother unraveled her corset from her leg and pulled it off and passed it to my grandfather. And from slits in the fabric, he squeezed out enormous diamonds. These were the same jewels that had been sewn inside Irena's bra, the one that my mother was dragging behind her the day her mother was killed. So now my grandfather lowered the stones onto the desk in front of the SS officer. There were earrings and rings, and the SS officer asked, "What do you want?" and my grandparents said, "We want you to save our child." Well, that officer took the diamonds, drove 15 miles and found my mother, and then took her to a convent. And that's where she spent the rest of the war. That man was a murderer, but something made him follow through. My mother always wanted to find the Catholic sisters who cared for her, and so with the help of some incredible people, I went to Poland and I found them. The convent where my mother was hidden was attached to this school that the sisters turned into an orphanage during the war for 75 children aged between 10 and 17. And the sisters told me that they had record of one hidden Jewish child, a little girl. But when they showed me this photo, I didn't think this was my mother. It couldn't be, because my mother was a toddler. She was 2 years old when she arrived at the convent. And if you remember that photo I showed you of hers in the stroller, this child looks smaller and thinner. And they told me that this child was cared for by Sister Cornelia, and that she couldn't be in the orphanage with the other children because she was Jewish, so she was hidden in Cornelia's room. And as I studied the photo, I noticed the bonnet, the child's bonnet. It was too big. And I realized that maybe if my mother hadn't had enough to eat, because it was a month or so after my grandmother had left her in her cot, perhaps this might be my mother. And then the sisters pulled out another photo of the little hidden girl at around 3.5 years old. And I remembered a photo of me as a child at the same age, and I realized this was my mother. When I found the sisters and I met their archivist, Sister Honorata in Warsaw, I phoned my mother to tell her the news, and then later that year she flew to Poland from Australia to meet them.
Just listen.
No może śpiewać,
Okay.
żeby dać
Na
spokój.
Joasza.
Witam serdecznie. To jest siostra, którą Kornelii Jankowskiej, która się Joasią opiekowała. Tak. Tak, tak. No, nie płacz, kochana, nie. Ale to zniszczone strasznie jest teraz. A tam był internet.
I remember them as mountains.
The-
I remember that.
You do remember that?
I remember being out here.
Yeah,
I think I played out here.
which is amazing, because if the SS was in this building, they were watching you.
It's amazing that they didn't
Kill you.
shoot me.
I know.
To strasznie zmarnowane wszystko.
When I saw my mother sitting in a pew in that tiny chapel, I realized that this is where her Christian faith began. And the following year, she actually completed her bat mitzvah in a synagogue with 2 other child Holocaust survivors. Through all my research and writing Irena's gift, I've learned that identity, particularly Jewish identity, is really complicated. And so is history and human behavior. I've learned that that line between right or wrong, guilty or blameless, isn't always clear. But what is clear is that the kindness of strangers saved my mother's life. I wouldn't be talking to you today if a few people hadn't have shown kindness and empathy towards my mother instead of indifference or hate. So thank you for listening, and now we're going to take questions.
Karen, how are you?
Hi Alex, I'm great. How are you?
I'm good. It's great to hear a colonial accent.
Same here.
Sorry about that. Are you joining us from Australia?
I'm actually in New Zealand at the moment.
Oh, okay. What are you doing there?
My husband's family live here, and so I'm here on vacation.
Oh, okay. Well, that was a very, very powerful story. You ended but a couple of amazing videos. The video of your grandfather was extraordinary. How did you react when you found that?
Well, I probably literally fell off my chair at the time. I mean, he had never talked about the war. I knew from my grandmother that he worked for the US Army after the war, but I found out much later more details of that. They hired him. He had been a lawyer before the war. He spoke 5 or 6 languages, and they hired him to be the administrative director of the war crimes branch in Dachau. And so he worked on the Dachau and Nuremberg trials and managed the SS bunker at Dachau. But when he came to Australia, he put all that behind him, and he had never mentioned the war to me at all. So when I found that video, it just changed my life. It was the fork in the road that made me finally get off my butt and fulfill the promise I had made my grandmother to tell her story and find out what happened to them.
Yeah, when you look at the video, he's very articulate. His English is excellent. The way that he controls his emotion is quite astonishing. So he'd been in the camps for 3 years by the time he was liberated.
That's right. The camps in the prison, yes.
Okay.
Various camps. And he'd survived a death march as well.
Right. You may be aware, and I don't want to shift the focus away from your story, but you may be aware that I wrote a book called The Liberator about a U.S. lieutenant colonel called Felix Sparks, who commanded the first Americans to liberate Dachau concentration camp on the 29th of April, 1945. So I've seen quite a bit of footage, but I've never seen that interview. It's very powerful. One of the people that I came across when I was doing my research was a guy called Jack Goldman. He changed his name. Obviously, Goldman wasn't his original Polish name, actually a German name. And he was liberated at Dachau. And he pointed out to me that only a small number of people in Dachau, when it was liberated, were actually Jewish. You know, people have this misunderstanding that every concentration camp was a death factory. Auschwitz was obviously a death camp, but those Jews who were in Dachau with your father had ended up in Dachau because they'd been force marched from Auschwitz and other camps further to the west. Can you tell us a little bit about how your father went from Auschwitz to Dachau? Do you know much about that?
I do. So he was my grandfather, and it's a little confusing because there were 2 grandfathers. So right. Dick and Mietek actually spent the entire war together. So they were death marched. After they got out of that prison in Radom, their lives were spared, thanks to Dick. Actually, he negotiated with an SS officer. He spoke the SS officer said, I've never been spoken to like a Jew like this. He basically bargained with him and said, I know you can send me to death or a camp. Please send us to a camp. And so they went to the Radom concentration camp, and from there they were marched to a city called Tomaszów, which was the death march, and then they were loaded onto trains for Auschwitz. And when they got to Auschwitz, Dick and Mietek were separated from Alicia, and she stayed in Auschwitz, and they went to a camp that was in Weihingen-Enz. I think it's really important, and I'm sure many of your listeners know this. You know, we know of the big camps, right? Auschwitz, Dachau, Belzec, Bergen-Belsen. But when you go to Dachau, you see this huge picture on a lit up wall of all the camps in Europe. There were more than 45,000 camps and ghettos throughout Europe. So they were in this one called Weihingen-Enz, and then they were sent to Dachau. And from Dachau, in Dachau, Metek actually got typhus right before the end of the war, and Dick was sent on a death march, and he ended up in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. And after the war, they found each other and were reunited. And Alicia went from Auschwitz to Ravensbrück in November 1944.
How do you react to the statistic that 9 out of 10 Polish Jews were murdered during the Holocaust? It's 9 out of 10.
I think statistics, I think it was Stalin who famously said 1 million deaths is a statistic. I can't remember the full quote, but it's true. Those numbers are just too big to grasp. And that was why it was so important for me to tell an individual story, because if you read in Irena's gift how my grandmother traded her wedding ring in Auschwitz for a piece of bread, you might not think of her as some nameless Holocaust survivor. And then if I tell you that we used to go to the beach together and we would collect seashells and stare at starfish in rock pools, you might think of her, you might remember something that you did with your family that was similar. And so next time you hear statistics like this, or you see on TV a story of somebody who's fleeing war, you might think differently about them, because those numbers are just 1.1 million murdered in Auschwitz and 1 million of those were Jews. Those numbers are just too big for us to comprehend. And at the time, we knew about Auschwitz. It was in the New York Times, though people couldn't believe that people were being murdered on that scale, and they ignored it.
So you live in the United States now. You that's your
I do.
That's your home. So how long have you lived in the United States?
Oh, more than 20 years now. So it is my home. I'm a US citizen, proud US citizen.
So I was in a classroom yesterday in Florida with a bunch of really bright, really smart 17 and 18-year-olds. And I asked them this question, can you name me a chapter in United States history? This country is almost 250 years old. Can you name me a chapter that makes you proud to be an American? And I had one hand go up out of 40 students, and that young man said, landing a man on the moon. That was an episode in US history that made him really feel pretty good about being an American. Now, when I listen to you talk about your family's history, it amazes me that every single young American doesn't immediately say, ending the Holocaust and liberating Western Europe in World War II is the greatest thing that any country in modern history has achieved. I mean, you look at Dachau, it was liberated by Americans, young Americans. Mm-hmm. There are over 50 nationalities, more than 30,000 people, one of them your father. They called the 29th of April, 1945, the Day of the Americans. How do you feel about this Holocaust education, et cetera, in the United States? Because you have to think to yourself, it's not doing a great job if most young Americans misunderstand what the Holocaust was even about, if they can't immediately say that ending the Holocaust, that working class Americans ending the Holocaust was an amazing thing. What's your reaction to this kind of growing and often willful ignorance?
I think it's interesting that you said that only that one student spoke up, because I think the statistic is it's 85% of young people 18 to 30, under 18 and 18 to 34 have never heard of Auschwitz. So, whereas our generation, your generation, and my generations, some of us learned it in school. It wasn't compulsory education at my school when I grew up, but in some states in the US, it is compulsory. But I think as more survivors die, there are so few of them left, and so many veterans who liberated the camps. I'll never forget the day once I didn't have this video, but I was talking about my family story at a public event, and a man stood up, and he was there when Dachau was liberated, and he saw, and he said he came because he wanted to tell everybody in the audience how important it was what he saw, and we need to make sure we never forget that again. But that's why it's important for my generation to, as children who grew up with these damaged people, who achieved the most amazing things, who started again from nothing, and some of them succeeded. Some of them I've also met many children survivors whose parents committed suicide. They couldn't, their mothers and fathers couldn't deal with what happened to them and what they saw other people do in camps like Auschwitz. But it's important for us storytelling is so powerful, because if you can hear a story about an individual, you're more likely to remember it than learning it out of history books.
Well, whenever I look at the Holocaust and when I look at World War II, I only want to come to one conclusion, which is that history is incredibly important. Without history, we have nothing. We have no identity. We have no past. We have no guide to the future. History is more important than it has ever been. You know, would you agree that history is so fundamental and central to who we are?
Absolutely. And for younger people, I think we have to change perhaps how we talk about that history. The reason why that video is so important, and I've only showed you a small clip, it's actually about 15 minutes long. When I showed that video to students in high schools and middle schools, their mouths drop. And they've been learning about this. They learn about the history, but when they actually see history, it reminds me and other teachers who are teaching this history how powerful it is for children today to mix it with, I hate to say the word entertainment. You've got to have some video. There's some powerful things happening with Holocaust survivors. They've recorded them as holograms. I have seen in one museum, they have, using AI, they've recreated the life of a 16-year-old boy who was killed. And he talks, they have a picture of him, and he's talking about what life was like before he was murdered. And then he talks about how he was killed and then what happened to his family after he was killed. So I think we just need to be a little bit more creative for young people today to bring history to life, making sure that it's accurately told, but use those new mediums to bring history to life.
I'm sure that you've read the book by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning.
Yes.
I reread it recently because we do a monthly top 10, and I was writing about books on Auschwitz, and I find it very interesting that Viktor Frankl, he basically says that Freud was wrong, that mankind's driving motivation is not for pleasure, but it is for meaning, that we are, that the core direction that we are all looking for is meaning. What did your research uncover for you about life and about the meaning of your life and about the meaning of all of our lives?
Oh, that's a very broad question, but I will zoom in on one thing that when I read Viktor Frankl's book that came to life for me, he also talks about, or I think it's called his theory of logotherapy, where he studied in the camps the people who are more likely to survive. And the ones, there was luck as well, but the ones who, what it taught me was, and this I think is where the meaning is, those that were more likely to survive were people who held on to, who focused on something to get them through. And so in the case of my grandmother, Litzia, what got her through and you can read more about this in Irena's gift, was her anger. She was very angry at Dick for a number of reasons, even though he saved his life over and over again. But that actually saved her life. Also, she told me what got her through was she wanted to tell the world what happened to her. What they couldn't believe, what they couldn't believe what was going on. And so they wanted to tell other people about it. In the case of Mietek, my grandfather Mietek, the one you saw in the video, what kept him alive was he wanted to see justice done, and he wanted to bring the war criminals to trial. So in the bunks in Dachau and at Vaihingen, he would have the prisoners memorize the names and numbers of the SS officers who perpetrated the most horrible things, and he would make them recount those crimes so that he could then document them. And the Americans helped him do that after the war, and then he could see some of those SS officers tried. So having something in times of crisis, or the unsettled world we live in today, I think the meaning, a key meaning in Viktor Frankl's book is we have to have something small to hang on to that keeps us going. And for me, that meaning is every time I look at the most horrible things that people can do to each other, I remember the people who saved my mother, and how they, when it was really easy to just turn their backs because there was a threat of death if it was discovered they were either harboring a Jewish child or they were smuggling food into the Warsaw Ghetto, they just did what they thought. They told their family members they did what they thought was the right thing to do. So that's the kind of meaning I choose to focus on.
When you look at the literature of the Holocaust, and in particular the really popular histories and movies like Schindler's List, do you not feel that in a way it's misportraying what really happened? Because the most popular narratives that are the ones that kind of reassure us that there are good people, that some people made it, that despite all the evil and the horror and the cruelty and the death, that human beings are incredibly resilient, when in fact the true picture is that very, very, very few people actually helped anybody. Mm-hmm. The vast majority of human beings kept their heads down, didn't want to risk their lives for anybody else, even often their own families. And in fact, when the real lesson of the Holocaust is that we are very close to a line where we tip quickly into being beasts. Mm-hmm. We are a species that's incredibly capable of genocide. Mm-hmm. We've repeated it over and over and over again. The United States was born out of genocide. Mm-hmm. Do you think that there's a kind of false, comforting narrative about the Holocaust that's set in?
My grandmother said to me, and I'll never forget this, she said to me, Karen, if you treat people like animals, they behave like animals. And she saw that in Auschwitz for survival. But I think that we have to have hope. The reason why those movies get made, and my mother said when she saw Schindler's List, it's a watered down version of the Holocaust. But the fact that it came out and it was told in a way that people could tolerate, if we write books that are just all about the horror, or made movies that are all about the horror, people wouldn't watch them. We need some hope. We also need someone to hate, but we also need hope. And so I have mixed feelings about books and movies like The Tattooist of Auschwitz, because they're not factually correct. But the fact is, and the Auschwitz Museum actually came out and said some pretty disturbing things about The Tattooist of Auschwitz when it came out. But the fact is, young people who read that book didn't know about the Holocaust before. So at least they've developed some kind of curiosity, and they might then go and visit Dachau. They might go and visit Auschwitz, and that starts the ball rolling. So yes, I think you're right. A lot of those films do sanitize what happened, and they often involve love stories. So there wasn't a lot of love in Auschwitz. People were just trying to stay alive.
Question here from JP Guides. What happened to the SS officer who saved your mother's life? Very good question.
Well, it's a really interesting question. When I first started out on this journey, so it took me 10 years to write Irena's Gift. And if you read it, you'll see I think there's something like 500 endnotes. It was really important to me that this story be told, it be a page turner, but be told as nonfiction. So I actually, when I first started out, all my friends were saying, well, you'll find the SS officer, you'll get the jewels back. It was like a romantic movie. That's not what it turned out to be. I did find out who he was, but the more I learned about him and the apparatus that he belonged to, I didn't want him to be the hero of the story. He's not named in the book. I think one reason I did that was I was helped in Germany by sort of serendipity. I fell across this organization that unites perpetrators with victims of the Holocaust. And I was connected with a woman in Munich who had been abused as a child. And when she went to a psychiatrist, the psychiatrist said, you need to ask your mother what your father did during the war. And it turned out he was a commandant in a concentration camp. So she had a horrible childhood. She was very damaged. And I realized that we don't get to choose our parents. So but we do have to live with their choices, and we have to live with what happened to them. So after I spoke with her, I realized that his family, the SS officer's family's children, may have had a similar experience. So I became less interested in making him a focus of the book.
Right. Is it possible to forgive?
That's
for
a
you?
good question. If you Google my name, you'll find an essay I wrote about my mother who did forgive. She even forgave the Gestapo officer who shot her mother, Irena, dead. I personally have a bit of an issue with forgiveness. I think that's a question for individual Holocaust survivors. If they have the capacity to do that, or not just Holocaust survivors, people who've endured horrible things, it's not for me to say anybody should forgive the perpetrators. It's up to the individual survivors themselves. And I'm sure you've talked to many of them who've been able to, and others who haven't been able to. I certainly am one of those who is unable to forgive them for what they did to my mother and her family.
Well, thank you for being very honest, because I think there's an awful lot of people who actually don't want to forgive. And part of the passion that they have for those who were righteous warriors in World War II is that they know that some people are evil, that we have beasts among us. And many men in World War II, Americans, British, Canadians, who were on the right side of history, were very prepared to give their lives to stop the evil that engulfed Europe. So I think it's a complicated issue.
It's really complicated. I mean, even in war today, we see examples of on our screens of soldiers who have maybe had some kind of background, and when they get into a war environment, even though with all their training, they're still capable of committing crimes. And I think it's really hard to pass judgment on people because we don't know their backgrounds. We don't know what happened to them. We don't know what they've seen in war. And it's all very well for us to sit on this side of history, looking back at and judge. I don't think we can do that.
Yeah, definitely. Well,
For individuals.
Yeah. Thankfully, being British and having lived in America for over 30 years, I know that I was on the right side, that I am on the right side.
Yes, absolutely. And thank God for that.
And I love the fact that both my grandfathers fought on the right side and that we defeated We defeated
Yes.
extraordinary evil. It's something that makes me very proud of what we do at the memorial. We
Yes.
celebrate and honor amazing people who stopped evil, who stopped the Holocaust.
Absolutely.
I loved your book. Are you working on another one now?
I am. I've got a couple of ideas I'm tossing around. One of them that relates to people who do extraordinary things, heroes who do extraordinary things in the most horrible circumstances. So
Right.
I'm really fascinated by that, as you see in Irena's gift. Human nature is very complicated, and we are capable of doing extraordinary good things and also, as you said, extraordinary evil things.
Well, we've had a couple of comments from people saying, is Irena's gift going to be a movie? Have you sold the film rights?
Not yet, but bring it on.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I want to thank you so much for your time, for joining us this morning. I really loved the book. We've had a lot of really good reaction. People are very grateful for your time. I am. And if you ever come to DC, we'd love to show you around the memorial. It would be wonderful.
I would love to do that. I would absolutely love to do that. Thank you, Alex.
And thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation and very enlightening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.